first presentation. So that's from Bianca. So Bianca's based in the New South Wales Hunter Valley, and it's at the heart of the Varroa mite incursion. So she's really well placed to talk to us about biosecurity and bees. Bianca's been a really keen beekeeper for over 10 years, and she's really passionate about agriculture and the environment and basically just the future of the beekeeping sector. So good on you, Bianca, for your passion in that area. Before what she's been doing currently, Bianca was working for the New South Wales Department of Primary Industries as a Varroa mite surveillance coordinator. So she's, as I said, really well placed to run us through some of those technical details and practical details of what Varroa mite and biosecurity means for bees. So Bianca, I'll hand over to you, and we'll have some time for questions at the end of your presentation. Thank you.
Lovely. Thanks very much for having me today. So look, yes, I work for the Australian Honeybee Industry Council. I'm currently the National Varroa Mite Coordinator, working within the New South Wales national response for the Varroa eradication and now the transition to management. I just wanted to start off with giving you some information around ARBIC's actual structure. If we could go to the next slide. So ARBIC is made up of 10 member bodies. So the member bodies actually represent beekeepers on the ground in our industry. And they also represent every step in the supply chain of the honeybee sector. So they all contribute to the networking directly with industry participants. Our board of directors operates within a structure that allows the CEO, Danny Lefebvre, and myself to work as an ARBIC team and represent industry outward to all of the other sections, including to the Department of Ag, Plant Health Australia, specifically port surveillance and bee biosecurity, and to be part of the response deed, which is how we've come to the place of being in the response for Varroa, and several others in the history of the honeybee industry. And we also have a direct line as an ARBIC team to the AgriFutures and Hort Innovations boards, where we receive lots of funding and we assist them into understanding what the key priorities are for our industry in research and development. We have a direct arm on occasion, depending on the state of the nation, in terms of federal and state departments to represent industry's needs and advocate for change if we feel the need. And then we've also got a really keen structure that's obviously growing at this stage, and you'll understand why when I finish through my presentation, with pollination-dependent industries across Australia. So we're part of the Plant Industry Forum, and we sit on several subcommittees that are representing the pollination-dependent industries. So we have an intrinsic link with them because of the nature of the honeybee industry and our connection to pollination. So if you want to go to the next slide. So a little bit about our industry. We are responsible for around 264 million GBP nationally. However, we also contribute around $14 billion towards the agriculture and horticultural industries and their production through pollination services. We do have an increasing demand for pollination and a decreasing domestic honey price, which has put us in a bit of a pinch point, given we're about to transition to managing Varroa. And then there's also an additional change to the industry that I'll outline in the next slide around the continual growth of recreational beekeeping and its impact on our honeybee industry itself. So if you have a look at the details in red, we just wanted to outline some industry stats to share an understanding of the size of our honeybee industry in Australia. And we focus on beekeepers in red. The number of recreational beekeepers has significantly increased in the last few years. And we think maybe this could be due to COVID, new hobbies that people take up, and beekeeping would be one of those. And then there also is an increased community interest and awareness of honeybees globally. And that is also a key driver in people taking up beekeeping as a hobby. The commercial sector, however, has had very limited growth. And if we look at the hive numbers in yellow, we notice that despite the number of commercial beekeepers remaining static, they've actually just increased the number of hives in which they manage. Now, the pressure on the industry, as mentioned before, is forcing beekeepers to need to have and manage more hives per enterprise. And our beekeepers are just operating in a tough environment currently, with low honey prices, with weather extremes, with diseases and pests that put pressure on them for managing. And of course, the uncertainty of the Varroa is adding to those challenges. Next slide. So some of our existing challenges in the industry exist around the key points here. Now, not all flowers are created equal. Having access to a range of floral resources is vitally important for reaching the nutritional needs of honeybee colonies. Quality resource access underpins healthy colonies and honey production in Australia. Currently, our honey production, about over 70% of the average 20-tonne national crop is produced from our native forests. So access to native forests is very important in the continuation of the national healthy colony population. The other important factor in terms of challenges for us is the importation of honey and the adulterated products. It's remained steady as an import to Australia over the last 10 years, but as domestic costs increase and the pressures remain with other areas, consumer choices do impact our industry's bottom line extensively, and a vast amount of our work is to portray to consumers to look at the label and purchase Australian honey. Another one is obviously, as part of this process today, is that biosecurity has a huge impact, both exotic threats and endemic pests and diseases. They're constantly felt by our industry. The costly impacts of hive losses and reduced efficiency in production and marketability in terms of live exports of honeybees to different parts of the world are all affected by biosecurity, and its impact is widely felt across a lot of the industry, regardless of their recreational or commercial aspect. The impacts on hive health can impact just like other intensive livestock enterprise. So we also have the other pressures of the environmental and natural disasters. So drought, floods and fires have had a constant presence in the honeybee industry over the last few years. And now obviously the new challenge is Varroa. So I wanted to touch on what is Varroa. If we click to the next slide. So it's a nasty little beast. It's a parasitic mite that originally evolved on Asian honeybees, and it did host shift onto the European honeybee. A few years back, it feeds on honeybees at all life stages of the honeybee's life cycle. It vectors pathogens as well, including the largest worldwide risk to honeybee health, and that's deformed wing virus, which is not present in Australia at the moment, but they do have very negative effects on honeybees and collectively a colony. So they feed on fat body tissue, they spread viruses, they induce foraging at a younger age. The bees, they then return with less pollen and nectar within their crops and their baskets. This then has a flow-on effect to smaller bees being born from the hive to work their life cycle, a reduction in their lifespan. And then it also impacts on the brain activity of honeybees, and it decreases their ability to return to the hive. So we lose a lot of bees day to day because of their impact from being fed on by Varroa at almost every stage of their life. If you want to go to the next slide. Honeybee colonies will eventually die from a Varroa infestation unless the mite population is continually reduced by some sort of intervention from a beekeeper. An individual mite doesn't kill one single bee, but it does suffer across the colony and eventually collapses. And it can have differing effects on colonies depending on the time of the year, the environment, and any existing pest and disease. So beekeepers will need to implement an intervention. And most of the time, these interventions cost money and time and effort. And so we move to the next slide and we talk about how these things would impact Australian industry. So we are the last major honey producing country in the world to be infested with Varroa. The global experience is likely to repeat here in Australia in the same similar conditions. We will lose between 20 and 30% of our commercially registered industry beekeepers, which also has a flow-on effect to the number of hives that we have in our country available to do pollination services and to produce honey. We'll have a 30% increase to the cost of production because we will have to spend time to intervene to colonies to save them from dying from Varroa. And that can be in the form of different types of integrated pest management techniques, including the costs of implementing chemical treatments to the colonies to be able to reduce Varroa numbers. And importantly, and a part of this particular presentation today is to really outline that 90 to 95% of feral colonies that exist in Australia's landscape will actually die, and they won't return unless they come from a managed colony that may swarm in the future. So over the next few years, we're going to experience a loss of feral colonies across our landscape, and this is going to have a really big impact on the dependency of crops that look for honeybee pollination for yields, etc., in different areas. So, and then the other top of the chain, I guess, in the impact that it will have on the industry is if we look at the experiences globally. The New Zealand experience is that they have annual colony losses of up to 20% of their colonies over the winter time that don't make it through to the next season. And in the US, they have an increased colony loss to around 50% of the colonies that they have in their country, which is a really big problem. And it takes a while to recover from that. But these are annual losses. So there is a constant requirement to build numbers and to maintain the national colony number to then underpin pollination security. The next slide gives us some information around the gradual increase and trend upwards of colony losses in the American industry, who've been living with Varroa for nearly 25, 30 years, and they have really suffered immensely. And a lot of that has been to do with the nature of the industry over there in terms of the change from honey production to relying on pollination events and services. So they also have had a really awful chemical bandwagon of treatments and ineffective treatments due to changes and lack of ability in the management systems that they've put in place. And we're learning from them as we move along in Australia with learning to live with Varroa. But this is a key point that I make, in that if we don't do our management well, we could follow suit in some of the same footsteps as our fellow beekeepers overseas. And the next slide will actually provide us with some detail around our closest neighbours, the New Zealand industry, who have less of an impact annually. However, they've been living with Varroa for nearly 15 years. They've had a really good education program that started in New Zealand at the time they decided to transition to management. That has underpinned a lot of really good education, great management techniques, and good practice that has underpinned their success at managing Varroa. They've also had a bit of a bubble in their Manuka honey production around the same time that Varroa really started to establish in New Zealand, and therefore the price of honey that they were receiving was far outweighing the cost that it takes to manage colonies. Their overall winter losses are sitting at around 12%, with variations among the seasons. But this year, in their loss project that manages the details and the data around their colony loss in New Zealand, they've started to take information around autumn losses, which is an important factor to consider, that they lose 16.8% in autumn, and then after winter they lose a further 12.7%. So this is a huge amount of colonies that come out of the system, that need to be rebuilt, and they take time to rebuild. So it is a cumulative effect on their industry, and it also has an impact on the ability for the industry to support pollination dependency as well. If you want to go to the next slide. Some of the things I wanted to share around the on the ground changes to our industry as a honeybee sector in terms of managing and considering the costs involved is that the beekeepers on the ground that have a livelihood or even a hobby in beekeeping are now acutely needing to assess their time management, their planning of how they're going to attack the levels of Varroa in their colonies when they know they've got Varroa, and implementing a knowledge-based integrated pest management strategies to keep their bees going. A lot of beekeepers will actually need to improve their skill sets for understanding how to manage Varroa and understand how their colonies are now changing over time with the Varroa infestation. We also need them to understand more about the colony phase and improvements to their management techniques, overall pest and diseases that cover a lot of the biosecurity risks we already have, and then Varroa on top of that. And I guess one of the points I like to make too is that the environmental conditions that we already have that persist, annually, sometimes biannually, sometimes every few years, we might have devastating floods in different areas or a long-term drought in certain spaces of the country. They will always be there, and they will pop up in the future. And now we have Varroa on top of those environmental considerations. So it's been a difficult time for beekeepers to pick up all this new information, but also still continue to battle on with all of the existing challenges that face them. And we did talk about the costs. The costs are not just in purchasing of chemicals, but the costs also there for the management, time and labour. And that has been a huge consideration in terms of what beekeepers think about when they're planning and implementing a strategy to manage varroa when they know they've got it. And the other thing is the consideration for the imminent pollination-dependent industries. So we'll be looking a little bit later on about some new roles coming into the industry that will help support and be the conduit into both the honeybee industry and pollination-dependent industries. But we do need to now consider a little bit more detail around the insurance of honeybee safety on farm, and we'll be going into that soon. I just wanted to show a couple of food crops that are dependent on honeybees. I've grouped them together because the table was quite large before I did this. I couldn't fit it all onto the one page. But I wanted to have a think about that 1/3 in the mouthfuls we eat comes from honeybee pollination. And it's not necessarily the food we eat, that is fruit and vegetables. It can also be fodder crops. So honeybees have long been recognised as the most efficient and effective pollinator for agricultural crops compared with other insects. Honeybees form colonies of large populations and with foraging field bees. Individuals have hairy legs and coats ready to attract and move pollen from one flower to the next. And it's important to realise that the rest of the world manages honeybees and produces food with Varroa, but there are additional challenges involved, and the annual crop losses or colony losses impacts that. So many of the major food crops rely solely on honeybees for pollination. Until Varroa populations will stabilise in Australia and honeybee industry gets on top of their management practices to sustain their colonies, reductions in our national managed hive numbers is expected, and this will have an impact. So along with the loss of feral hives, pollination dependency will become realised as the mite spreads, and as the growth in agriculture and horticulture increases, so too will the need for commercial pollination services that support some of the most pollination dependent crops. The dependency scale in this table really outlines the key that honeybees provide in essential pollination for food security. Next slide. So just a little snippet of some experiences that I had. Many growers at the moment rely on some scale to feral bees to provide their free pollination services. And feral colonies are often the greatest risk from Varroa, as there's no management to mitigate the loss. So the degree to which Australian industries will rely on free pollination is not well understood, but it's difficult to say for certain that what the impact of losing our feral populations will be. But here's 2 raspberries. Now, I took them from the same tunnel on the same day back in February 2023, a visit to the Narna Glen region of New South Wales, which at the time was a red eradication zone under the emergency response for Varroa. No honeybees were able to go into the polytunnels or on this farm during the flowering in the previous October 2022. From inside the tunnel on the left, you can see that the fruit didn't set, the pollination hadn't been achieved, and that fruit can't even be removed correctly from the set. It will crumble in your hand if you tried to remove it and put it in a punnet. Once it was to go the right colour and be ready to pick, it wouldn't actually be able to be picked. And then this outer edge on the right-hand side of the tunnel, it actually maybe had some feral honeybees visit the site from the area around the farm. At the time, we weren't 100% certain that all of the feral bees had been removed. However, this particular one on the right that I've got a photo of does have a better fruit set, and it does have the opportunity there to potentially grow into a better sized fruit that would be worth a crop for that farmer. But the majority, I'm talking maybe 95% of the fruit that they were looking to gather that season in that February timeframe was not reliable, was not a crop at all. So they did introduce some fly species during the flowering period in October because there were no bees or honeybees that were able to be put on those sites. It didn't have a very positive impact on the quality and the quantity of the yield from this farm, unfortunately. So across the globe where production horticulture is required, there's really no alternative pollinator that provides the pollination services at the same scale as the honeybees. Next slide. Just a little bit about, we've gone one, that's the right one, sorry. In large crops, there may be multiple beekeepers engaged to achieve the required hive density for pollination. This introduces the biosecurity risk in itself due to robbing and the drifting of honeybees between hives. And it will become more risky with Varroa becoming endemic. And there's lots of it's stress upon the industry on pollination services in the next few years, as Varroa hasn't completely spread across all of Australia, rather than it is contained at the moment in a New South Wales state. But all pollinating species rely on the presence of floral resources like pollen and nectar. So most crop pollinating insects, including honeybees, are just generalist feeders that have a broad diet and require the presence of a variety of pollen and nectar sources. So if growers take steps to maximise bee health and other pollinator health on their properties, the colonies that are pollinating their crops will perform better and be better placed to withstand Varroa, to withstand the other biosecurity threats that exist for those particular pollinators. It will make beekeeping more expensive and less profitable to live with Varroa. It could, in fact, then drive the price of pollination contracts upwards if the nature of the farm space that honeybees are taken to is not one that is productive for beekeepers. The next slide. So a little bit about the opportunity for a sustainable future, and it isn't all doom and gloom. There's no doubt beekeeping will be more difficult, but hive health, and even in managed colonies, by well-skilled beekeepers, will be significantly difficult to maintain. Improving colony health improves pollination efficacy, and it better supports hives living with Varroa. So to enhance the health and diversity of pollinators and ensure pollination services remain reliable and resistant and resilient now and in the future, the floral support should be available year-round for honeybee colonies and also in the close proximity to crops. So the hive health before, during and after a pollination event all contribute to a sustainable food production system. So access to those floral resources when beekeepers are not performing a pollination service underpin the health of the colonies when they do turn up for a pollination contract. So we need to think about providing sites for honeybees that are sheltered on the site of a farm with clean water. And a big factor now for some beekeepers is to make sure that the site is profitable for them, that when they leave, their hives are healthy and they're not impacted by some of the practices that occur on farm. So it's important that farmers and growers begin to understand the needs of honeybee colonies during the time they're on site, and then considering using some integrated pest management techniques to actually manage the health of honeybees while they're on farm, in considering additional floral resources like underplantings and supporting the honeybee nutrition that way. Some crops are not particularly important or good for honeybees when they're in a pollination service, so underpinning them with better floral resources is also useful. And it's shown that it doesn't impact necessarily on the quality of pollination, rather that it improves it in some instances. Next slide. Some of the most important tools that beekeepers and growers can use in the future to ensure a long-term, hassle-free and mutually beneficial business relationship is communication. A national pollination coordinator will soon be recruited by the National Transition to Management Program for Varroa. So this role will strategically support and partnership between beekeepers and pollination-reliant industries for the 12-month term of the program. The aim of it is to incentivise growers to take steps to maximise bee health and minimise impacts, including things like integrated pest management and reducing pesticide exposure. Some farms may have never engaged with beekeepers, and until Varroa starts to spread and become an endemic pest across the country, some growers may have never investigated the additional implications of their practice on farm and how that might impact colony health. So we're looking at improvements to all stages of production, including bringing beekeepers on farm and having those communication channels really well established so that we can have a successful and sustainable future. Next slide. Raising awareness and increasing ARBIC's advocacy for industry well into the future is the best way to assure us a sustainable industry in the years to come. So we're progressing through an education and extension program that's underway in the Transition to Management program. I'll be managing for the next 12 to 18 months the Varroa development offices across the country, which are designed to take on beekeepers in the field and to give them hands-on experience and support in their beekeeping practice. We're aligning and updating our Australian Beekeeping Industry Code of Practice as well, which will accommodate Varroa challenges and the best practice guides to be able to live with Varroa for honeybee industry. And we know that in a biosecurity situation that codes of practice are actually a really good place and a foundation for best management across industry, but also an understanding then of and the awareness of honeybee health for those pollination-dependent industries that need us and work together in that. There'll also be, and has already begun, some Varroa management education workshops across the country that support industry in teaching them about managing Varroa and some of the impacts that they are expected and some planning that they might like to begin to do to consider what they're going to do with their decision making once they do have Varroa in their colonies. And on the horizon, we've completed some agri-futures forums supporting the advancement of a national Varroa strategy for research and development, and also a queen bee sector analysis. This presentation doesn't have a lot of time to go into the queen bee sector, but there is some really important work that needs to be commenced to start a national bee breeding strategy to actually support some opportunity for Varroa-resistant honeybee genetics to strengthen our industry even further. So we continue to address national priorities for the industry with collaboration and listening to contribute and improve the productivity to promote and protect the honeybee industry's interest. We continue to be involved in the shared responsibility of managing biosecurity on the ground through research and capacity building, growing awareness and information with thoughtful leadership and coordination for proactive industry. And part of that, as I said earlier, is pushing for Australian consumers to support 100% Australian honey at the shops, check the labels and do those things so that you can be part of the solution to safeguard Australia's pollination future.
Thanks, Bianca. That was very detailed and really informative. So thank you very much for that. I think, look, in the interest of time, are you able to stick with us till the discussion session? Excellent.
Yeah, definitely.
We might just carry questions forward.